The previous studies in this series have focused on sources independent of the Bible to establish a basis for believing in the existence of a supernatural first cause and designer. Now that's an important place to start because it helps us to put the Bible's description of the Creator into the context of His creation. Now this doesn't mean that science and logic are more important, but I firmly believe that God gave us both, and that He intended for us to test His Word against the evidence He has given us. That said, we're finally ready to bust out the Bible. Now the biblical account of creation has been the subject of much controversy in Christian circles. I give the following brief overview of the various Christian views on creation after reading a number of arguments by proponents of each. Keep in mind that this is a generalization. I'm sure there are plenty of variations within each camp. On the most liberal end of the debate are the theistic evolutionists. They believe that macroevolution is true, and that God is the first cause of the universe's existence, and that He guided the process of evolution to bring life to the world over billions of years. They believe that this is true of Adam and Eve as well, and that Adam and Eve had biological parents, though it was through Adam that the human race fell. Thus, they argue that Genesis 1 through 2 should be understood to be symbolic, like Christ's parables and many of the passages in Revelation. Now on the opposite extreme are the young earth creationists, who largely reject the conclusions of modern science as too biased to be believed, and generally interpret science in light of their presupposed interpretation of Genesis. They believe that Genesis should be understood to be a literal account, and that the English translations are correct in implying 24-hour days of creation. Young earth creationists believe that God created the earth with the appearance of age. After all, He being God is certainly capable of such a thing. A variation of young earth creationism is the gap theory, which proposes that there's a gap of billions of years between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and that God essentially started over with His creation 6,000 years ago. In between these two views are the progressive or old earth creationists. Like theistic evolutionists, they accept modern science's understanding of the age of the earth and universe, and do not have a problem with the assertion that life existed billions of years ago. The primary difference between them is that progressive creationists do not believe that God used macroevolution to develop His creation, but that over millions and billions of years He created new creatures to inhabit His world. Progressive creationists believe that man was the last of these special creations, and generally agree with young earth creationists that the human race began roughly 6,000 years ago with Adam and Eve. Progressive creationists hold to a fairly literal reading of Genesis, although their understanding of certain word meanings differs from that of young earth creationists. As alluded to earlier, these differences often cause division among Christians, with some young earth creationists accusing old earth creationists of letting science water down their belief in the Bible, and some old earth creationists accusing young earth creationists of naively ignoring or twisting the facts of science to fit their biblical interpretation. While I will be arguing for the position in this debate that I find the most convincing after a good deal of research, I want to start off by making one thing clear. Christianity is a religion of faith, and the Bible makes it clear that belief in Christ as your personal Savior is what justifies you before God, not the mechanism by which you believe God created the universe. Each of the positions I just outlined are consistent with this principle, and disagreement over them should not be the basis for doubting a brother's faith. It's not something we can know for sure, and it's not something we have to know for sure, so it's okay to disagree. Still, this is a valid topic to discuss, and I believe that when we really study the subject of life's beginnings, it can serve to greatly strengthen our faith in God and our appreciation for His marvelous creation. When I began preparing this series, I was a young earth creationist, and I expected my research to back up this position. I respected the scientific method and had always been interested in how things worked, but I believed that most scientists were too biased and had used circular reasoning to establish an age of the earth that fit with their naturalistic assumption. But as I started exploring the subject further, I realized that this wasn't a fair assessment. At first, this worried me because I was being forced to change beliefs that were closely related to my Christian faith. But believing that God wanted me to seek the truth using the mind He gave me, I continued to research, and ultimately found that the Bible does indeed hold up to these challenges very well. It was incredibly liberating. I no longer had to dismiss scientific discoveries about our world or blindly assume that shows like the BBC's Planet Earth were wrong, when they explained how various geological phenomena were produced over millions of years. I didn't even have to cringe when I heard the word evolution, because I understood that small-scale evolution in the context of an active, intelligent designer is both reasonable and biblically acceptable. I hope the next two studies help you to have a similar experience. As you may have gathered by now, I find the arguments for progressive creationism to be the most factual and to not contradict the Bible. I'll be spending the rest of the study and the next explaining why this is the case, but first I want to address the possible complaint that progressive creationism, being in the middle of the young earth and theistic evolutionist extremes, is somehow a weak compromise. One of my favorite authors, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, devotes a chapter in his book Orthodoxy to a similar criticism of Christianity. Here's a summary of the chapter from a review of Orthodoxy that I wrote some years ago. In Chapter 6, Chesterton explains how he was made more orthodox as a result of reading and hearing the arguments of anti-Christians. One would convince him that Christianity was far too much of one thing, but then another would argue that it was too much of the opposite. After reading one contradictory argument after another, Chesterton began to realize that rather than Christianity being an awfully odd and contorted monster, it could actually be the only perfect and ideal entity. If one person attacks it for being too pacifist, and another for it being too violent, perhaps Christianity is actually perfectly balanced. Not too violent, but not too pacifist. Perhaps these contradicting extreme complaints about Christianity only prove it to be the opposite of extreme: normal, reasonable, and sane. Quote, "All sane men can see that sanity is some kind of equilibrium, that one may be mad and eat too much, or mad and eat too little." Yet this balance between two extremes is not a solution of the two extremes that results in a dumbed-down compromise. It's a mixture that keeps both pure while combined to produce a perfectly non-extreme result. Quote, "Christianity has kept the two extremes side by side like two strong colors, red and white. It has always had a healthy hatred of pink." I mention this argument by Chesterton to simply show that, like Christianity, progressive creationism can be viewed as a sane combination of two extremes that results in a proper balance. In other words, it brings a firm belief in the accuracy of Genesis together with an honest acceptance of the facts found by scientific discovery. The result? A Christian theory of origins that I believe to be well supported by both science and the Bible. While it's certainly possible that God did indeed create the universe with the appearance of age, and that really has only been here for 6,000 years, that only raises the question of why God would do it that way. If wise people are to store up knowledge, as Proverbs 10:14 tells us, and Christians are to have a reason and defense for our hope, as in 1 Peter 3:15, why would God plant fossils of life deep within the layers of the earth in a specific order? Why would there be background radiation, giving evidence of a cosmic explosion billions of years ago? Why would there be such clear evidence of natural mechanisms for mountain building, microevolution, glacial carving, and evidences of past atmospheres preserved deep within the ice on the poles? We cannot know for sure whether or not God created the world and all life in a week's time. But if we are to take seriously the evidence built into His creation, the case for a young earth becomes flimsy at best. Of course, this is based upon the assumption that scientific methods of dating are reliable. Growing up, I remember hearing and reading the claim that scientists don't have any absolute dating methods, but that they essentially date rocks by the fossils that they contain, and date the fossils by the rocks that they're in. Radiometric dating was supposedly a subjective process, where scientists assumed certain things in order to get the readings that they wanted. After researching the matter and reading what true experts in the field have to say, it became clear that discrediting scientists in this way is incredibly unfair. There are many reasons that scientists believe the Earth and the universe to be billions of years old, and even more reasons to believe that they're more than 6,000 to 10,000 years old, as young Earth creationists argue. But probably the reason most relevant to biology, and perhaps the most misunderstood, is radiometric dating. So I'd like to briefly explain why this method gives us good reason to accept the Earth's age as being in the billions of years, not thousands. Christian physicist Dr. Roger C. Wyans did his PhD thesis on dating meteorites and explains the radiometric dating process well in his lengthy article called Radiometric Dating, A Christian Perspective. Now, igneous rocks are formed when molten lava or magma cools. When this happens, the material in the rock is no longer free to move around and is frozen in place. Although many of the elements in these rocks are stable and do not experience radioactive decay, some do. Because of the consistency and accuracy with which we can measure radioactive decay, we generally know an element's half-life with about 98% certainty. We also have no evidence that shows this decay rate ever changing, no matter what environmental variations may occur. Scientists have subjected samples to intense heat, cold, pressure, movement, etc., beyond anything that they would have experienced in nature, and found that decay rates do not undergo any significant change. As the radioactive elements decay, they produce daughter material. By measuring how much daughter material there is in the rock, scientists can calculate how many years it would have taken to produce it. Of course, to get an age from this, we have to know how much, if any, of this daughter material was there initially. In some cases, this can be done with another test. For example, the argon-argon method is used to determine how much argon was originally in the rock, so that the potassium-argon method can be accurately used. In others, it involves some rather complicated mathematical calculations. Additionally, there are over 40 radiometric dating methods, so by using multiple tests, the dates can be justified with greater certainty. There have been a number of arguments against these methods, one of the more notable being a young Earth creationist research group called RATE, or Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth. One of their arguments is that rock material decayed much faster just after creation than they do now. However, the rate of decay necessary to produce the amounts of daughter material that we see today in such a short amount of time would have produced so much energy so fast that the Earth would have been vaporized. Another challenge put forth by young Earth creationist Russell Humphreys is based upon the existence of helium in zircon crystals. He argues that over billions of years this helium should have diffused out of the crystals, so its presence establishes that the Earth is much younger. However, founder of Old Earth creationist website AnswersInCreation.org, Greg Nyman and many scientists have pointed out that their study fails to consider a number of variables and other possible sources for this helium. There are many well-researched Old Earth creationist responses to the arguments of Rate and others at Nyman's website if you care to read more. There's a lot more to this subject, but I think that an honest look at the facts does indeed make a solid case for the Earth being far older than young Earth creationists claim. Now, what does the Bible say? The main point of contention among Christians over the age of the Earth is in the translation of the Hebrew word yom, which reads as day in most English translations of Genesis. So we need to look at this in more detail. According to Strong's exhaustive concordance of the Bible and the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, yom can mean 24-hour day, days, year, season, period of time, age, and so on. In the New American Standard Bible, it is translated as all of these and more, depending on the context in which it is used. Young Earth creationists have argued that the word yom always refers to a 24-hour day when preceded by an ordinal, such as the words second, third, etc. in Genesis. However, while this may often be the case, it is not a rule in the Hebrew language. Why such a nonspecific word? Well, the Hebrew language, particularly back then, had fewer words than a language like English, which borrows from other languages and can be very specific because of its huge vocabulary. Thus, context and implied meaning is more important in Hebrew because the language is not as diverse. So while you would probably use the word period or span or epoch to refer to a vast stretch of time in English, in Hebrew you would use the more general word yom. Thus, if you look at the original language of Genesis 1 without assuming from your English translation that it's referring to 24-hour days, it's not a stretch to conclude that yom in Genesis could refer to a lengthy span of time. Of course, Genesis 1 itself does not give us any particular reason to use this translation of yom, but the larger context of science and indeed other biblical passages do. The third day of creation described in Genesis 1:12 says that, quote, "The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, and trees bearing fruit with seed in them, after their kind, and God saw that it was good." This is a process that would normally take at least a year to occur, certainly not one day. This is also probably true of the sixth day, in which God plants the Garden of Eden and teaches Adam. Genesis 2:4 lumps the entire creation period into one yom. Quote, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that the Lord made earth and heaven." Hebrews 4, though a bit hard to follow, seems to imply that the seventh day of rest, which is not concluded in the Genesis account as the other days are, is ongoing. Quote, "For we who have believed enter that rest. For he has said somewhere concerning the seventh day, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Therefore let us be diligent to enter that rest, so that no one may fall." 2 Peter 3:8 says that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day. In addition to all of this, of course, is the fact that the study of nature itself clearly describes an old earth and universe, which cannot be explained by a week-long creation event 6 to 10,000 years ago, unless we assume that God created the universe with the appearance of age. This would mean that learning more about the history of nature is meaningless, and that evidences such as the fossil record should be ignored. Since I don't believe God intended for us to have to ignore the evidences in His creation, I disagree with this view. A correct understanding of what Yom could have referred to is important in realizing that an old earth view of creation does not contradict the Bible. It's also important to realize that while we as Christians believe in the inerrant and true Word of God, that doesn't mean that God's revelation hasn't often simplified difficult concepts so that we can understand them. Jesus often used parables to put spiritually profound ideas into words that fishermen could understand. The end times are described to John through visions that many Christians understand to be symbolic rather than literal. Now, I don't buy into the idea that Genesis is entirely symbolic, because the creation account seems to be written like other passages that clearly refer to actual events rather than immaterial visions. But obviously no human was around to witness the creation of the universe, so I think it's clear that God described or revealed through some sort of vision these events in a simplified and perhaps imprecise way that would have made sense to early mankind. A detailed description of the exact sequence by which God formed the earth and created life would have gone way over the heads of whoever He told it to. A vague description of God creating light and morning and evening to make a day would have made much more sense to them than describing a spinning planet orbiting a massive burning ball of gas, all of which formed over billions of years as the universe expanded. While today's scientists might appreciate such an explanation, it would have only confused people for thousands of years. I'd like to make a final point that I think is rather important. It ties in with the verse I quoted from 2 Peter about 1,000 years being like a day to God. God, being the supernatural creator of the universe, exists in eternity, and thus what we know of His time has no effect on Him. That's why it's not somehow limiting to God's power to think that He took billions of years to create the earth, and may have used what seems to us to be a slow process to differentiate and introduce life on earth. Now, if you would, try to picture in your mind a speck of matter, time, and energy, the universe before the Big Bang, created out of nothing by God. Next, imagine it rapidly expanding. You see matter spread out and arrange itself into planets and stars. The incredibly precise laws of nature are already existing, with gravity holding solar systems together and matter converting into energy in the form of radiation. These solar systems arrange themselves into galaxies, which continue to spread out as space expands. Now zoom in on one of those planets. It doesn't look like Earth yet, but it's orbiting our Sun at a specific distance, resulting in an exposure to radiation that is neither too strong nor too weak to support what we know of as life. It's been there for a while, and on its surface has reigned a vast ocean from a water vapor-dominated atmosphere. As it spins and orbits the Sun in an orderly way, the surface is exposed to a constant cycle of light and darkness. The internal energy of the planet drives the plates of land underneath the ocean to move with respect to each other, some floating higher than others and emerging from the water to become dry land. As these plates continue to move and split, they migrate across the earth, some colliding into one another to form mountain ranges. As they diverge, molten rock from below cools and expands the ocean floors. Then, tiny microorganisms like bacteria and algae appear in the land and begin to change the composition of this early Earth atmosphere into something more conducive to other forms of life. After this process has continued for a while, new and different life forms appear which are highly complex arrangements of these earlier building blocks. As each component of the life that we see today is established, new ones can be introduced which depend on them. Eventually, we see the highly diversified, complex, and beautiful world ecosystem that exists today. With the animal and plant kingdoms firmly in place, a new being appears, one who shares physical characteristics with the other creatures because of their dependence upon the ecosystem already established. But aside from these physical similarities, they are vastly different. Unlike every other life form on Earth, they can feel, reason, question, wonder, theorize, love, hope, dream, and pray. They are influenced by conscience and emotions, which sometimes contradict the instinct of self-preservation that drives the actions of their fellow Earth dwellers. They are more than animals, for they have a supernatural component, a soul. What I just described was largely hypothetical, although the basic ordering tends to coincide with what science has found. Interestingly, it also coincides with the biblical sequence, as we will see next time. But the larger point I wanted to make was that we just spent a few minutes visualizing a sequence of events that by nearly all accounts took billions of years. If you visualize it sped up like this, it is clearly miraculous. But why would it be any less miraculous for it to have taken a long time from our perspective, when to God 1,000 or million or billion years is like one day? In the next study, we will look at the Genesis account verse by verse, including the creation of man, and see how it fits in with the natural evidences that we see. We'll also look at what science and the Bible tell us about the flood, and briefly touch on the topic of dinosaurs.